Glad I muted that one. Welcome everybody to Tree School Online. I'm Mike Clossy, Director of Forestry with the Oregon Forest Resources Institute, and it's my pleasure to be your host for today's Tree School Online webinar. Tree School Online is a production of the OSU Forestry and Natural Resources Extension Program and the Partnership for Forestry Education. And we want to give special recognition today to OFRE and to the Clackamas Extension Group for leading this project this year, and also to the U.S. Forest Service and the Oregon Department of Forestry for providing a grant to us to cover our expenses. Tree School Online webinars are scheduled currently for the first and third Tuesday of each month at 3 p.m. and they'll run from now until June 15th, and it's looking good. So we appreciate for you being here. We got a few details. For those, most of you I see from the participant list are regulars, but we've got a few newbies. So I want to overview the way Zoom works for us. We do our webinars on Zoom Webinar, and everything is controlled by the Zoom toolbar, which should be located at the bottom of your screen. If it doesn't show up, some models where you move the mouse around, and when you get the cursor at the bottom, the toolbar will open up. On iPads and on some other hardware, some other tablets, it's at the top rather than at the bottom. Most of the features that I'll talk about and that we'll use in our webinar are accessed through the Zoom toolbar. Audio is muted for participants, so you don't need to worry about that. Video is not available for your participants either, just for the panelists. We do our written questions through the Q&A toolbar, got the Q&A box. And so it's on the bottom toolbar, about in the middle. There's a little says Q&A, and if you open that, that's where you can write your questions to Tammy. We do not use chat for our questions. We use chat to communicate with you about resources, about upcoming programs, about other things like that. And also if you're having technical difficulties, that's a good place to get them answered. But your questions for Tammy should be in the Q&A box. We do have some resources, and they will be listed on the class guide, which can be accessed either from the Tree School Online guide or the Beeves Tree School Online and class guide as shown on your screen right now in that slide. And Amanda Brenner, who is managing the chat for us today, will also post that on there so you can find the resources after the fact. The webinar will be recorded, and like all our webinars, if it's successful, we will post it again on the Tree School Online page and on the class guide page. So you should be able to get those. It takes about a week to get them converted and posted. Finally, the last thing before I introduce Tammy is we will be using polls, and on the bottom of your toolbar, when there could be on some versions of Zoom a button that says polls, and when the poll is ready, that button will light up. For most of us, it'll just pop up when I activate it, and you'll be able to answer your questions, and then we'll talk about your answers. In some rare cases, poll doesn't work for people because of pop-up blockers or whatever. But, you know, we just can't control everything in life, and polling is one of those. So anyway, we hope you're able to use it, and we hope you will use it, because I think Tammy has some great polls. So I'll now introduce Tammy, and while I'm giving her introduction, I'll ask her to turn on her camera and her audio. And welcome, Tammy.
Good afternoon.
Tammy is a professor at OSU, assistant professor and extension specialist in forest economics, management, and policy, and she holds the Starker Chair for Private and Family Forestry, a very prestigious position, and we're so glad to have Tammy here today. She has a forestry degree from University of Florida, real big Gator fan, 2 master's degrees in forest economics and taxation from Mississippi State, and a PhD from the University of Florida. And most of you know her, but it doesn't take too long to learn that she's not from around here, but she's been here long enough that she's beginning to think like a beaver. So you got to watch her. In her role in extension, Tammy works to educate landowners and forest tax professionals about the economics of growing trees and about the tax code. She also is serving this year as the president of the Society of American Foresters. So welcome, Tammy. Tell us about what you're going to tell us about.
Sure, thank you, Mike. Oh, that didn't start good. I cannot advance.
Okay, click on the slide first and then try it.
Thank you very much. Troubleshooting 101. All right, so today we're going to talk about thinking about the future of your forest and talk about ways to pass it on, not getting really far into the weeds, but really just talking about some of the process in this succession planning.
All right. Before we turn Tammy loose, those of you that are Tree School Online fans know that we use polls as a way to find out what's on your mind. And I will launch the first poll and talk about it. So the first poll, we talk about, first of all, I want to know where you're from: Willamette Valley, Coastal Oregon, Southwest Oregon, Central or Eastern Oregon, Washington State, USA. Not that Washington State isn't in the USA, but other parts of the USA besides Oregon and Washington, and outside the USA. You can only get one choice for that one. Number 2 is a multiple choice, so you could have multiple answers. Are you a woodland owner, a private natural resource professional, an agency natural resource professional, a nonprofit natural resource professional, or an other? And the final that we ask every week or every webinar is, how many acres of forest land do you own or manage? 0, 10 or less, 10.1 to 40, 40.1 to 100, 100.1 to 1,000, or 1,000 more than 1,000. And then Tammy has 2 questions that she'll talk about. Do you have a will? Yes or no? And if you don't know what a will is, say no, because you must not have one or you'd know what it was. And do you have a forest management plan? Same rules apply, yes or no. And if you don't know what it is, say no, because if you had one, you'd know what it is. So looks like most people have answered. It's still going up. So I'm going to give you a little more time. We find that usually about 80% is the max out. We never get more than 80% participation, and we're hovering right around 60 now. So I think if I gave you 10 more seconds, we'd hit 80%. There's 5 questions, so it's a lot more work this time. All right, I'm going to stop it right there and launch the results. So what we see is that 60% almost of you are from the Willamette Valley, some the coast, some Southwest, nobody from the east side today, unless they're from Washington State. 10% from the USA outside of Washington, Oregon, nobody from outside of the US. Most of you are woodland owners, 90%, but about the remainder are also some private natural resource professionals and one other. The ownership is pretty average. Actually a little bigger than average. Typically we go the 40 to 100 is our biggest, but here it's the 100 to 1,000, which obviously the more land you own, the more important it is to think about succession planning. And then I'll let you talk about the last 2, Tammy. Do they have a will, and do they have a forest management plan, and why is that important?
Sure. So the question on the will, the reason I want to know that is to kind of gauge where everybody's at, or just at least whether we started thinking about this. And so it's showing that 76% of you have a will. So congratulations. That's a great first step. What I probably should have asked is whether you have a current will, like have you looked at it in the last 5 years? A lot can happen. So we'll talk about that. And then as a forester, I feel like I always should ask you whether you have a forest management plan. Mainly because this goes towards continuity of management. So if you were not around tomorrow, would the people taking over know what the plans were for the land? And that really is what that forest management plan is going to do for the people taking over. So that's kind of why I'm asking that. 67% of you have said that you have a forest management plan. Again, could ask whether that's current as well. And if you haven't looked at it in 5 years, maybe you need to go take a look at that. So
excellent. I'll stop sharing the results and turn it to you, Tammy. I will be back at halftime to do another poll and do some Q&A, and take it away.
Great, thank you very much. Let's see if I can get this. There we go. So, you know, a lot of people, when they approach this, the first thought they have about succession planning really is this feeling of dread. Part of it is the concept of not being around. We as human beings don't like to think about life afterwards, after our death. So we really are not into that kind of thinking. And succession planning forces you to kind of acknowledge that part of being human, of the fact that we're not going to be around forever. So today, we're going to go to some uncomfortable thought processes, and we're going to have to think ahead. And my goal today is to kind of give you some process for getting to a point of having a succession plan and then an estate plan. So just kind of to give you, Mike told you who I am academically. I want to tell you who I am as a person, because the reason I'm doing this isn't because I think it's fun to talk about succession planning, but because each of us have multiple roles in our lives. So me, I'm a wife, I'm a mother of two, but I'm also a daughter. And so I've gone through this transfer process, even though it didn't involve land. And it wasn't done very well, and it created a lot of strife within our small family. And so for me, I feel very strongly that we need to have these conversations, and we need to do it a little bit ahead of time, not on death's bed. I do have degrees in forestry, and so I am looking at this from the lens of a forester and wanting to see the land continue to be managed the way that we like to manage it as forest landowners. And then I, you know, for fun, throw in the tax background and the finance, and those are the tools that I'm going to use to help me get to where I want to go. Mike told you I have extension research and teaching, and I will tell you I am a blast at parties because I'm going to talk about death and taxes, and who doesn't want to hear about that at a party? So why do we do this? Why do we need to talk about succession planning? So the data in front of you is from the National Woodland Owners Survey. Some of you may have taken that survey in the past, done by the U.S. Forest Service. This particular table is for people that have 10 or more acres, and it's looking at whether you answered that you were selling or giving away land in the next 5 years, and then more importantly, who is likely to receive it. So if we look at the table in front of you, I'm reading that we have about 23% of the acres that would be likely to have been given away or sold within the next 5 years based on that 2013. So that's talking about kind of that transfer, about 23% of the acres. From an ownership standpoint, it's about 22%. What I'm really more interested in is the bottom part of this, where it talks about the likely recipient. And you're like, well, why would you be more interested in who the recipient is? So the data I see in front of me tells me that 56% of the respondents said that their children were the likely recipient. And my question is, if that was you answering that, have you talked to your children about them receiving it? That's where we're going to go today. It's more than just making the decision. It's about having the conversation about the decisions you've made. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And then if we start looking at what questions people are asking, what advice are they looking for? This is also Oregon landowners with more than 10 acres. And you see, as far as advice on woodland management, we all expect that those questions will come up. That's about 49%. But the next line is the advice on how to transfer land to the next generation. So the same number of acres are asking that question about transferring it as they're asking about woodland management. Now, it's not quite as many of the ownerships, but it is engaging that many acres. So we need to start having these conversations and figuring out what is the future of our land. So I asked you in the question before whether you had a will. So I'm going to now ask you to think about whether you've started planning. And I want you to know that whether you've started actually going any further than that, you aren't alone. No matter where you are in this process, you're not alone in this. We asked a group of people where they were in the process, and you see that 35% hadn't started. And I didn't define what hadn't started meant. I let them decide for themselves where they were. 35% said they hadn't started. Now, we know average age of the landowner based on the National Woodland Owner Survey is in the 60s. So if you haven't started in your 60s, there's no better time to get started. So we saw that 42% were working slowly on it. Okay, so something is better than nothing, but there are certain parts you have to get through in order for the plan to actually work. 18% said they were done. I'm going to argue you're never done. That may not be what you want to hear this afternoon, but you're never going to be done with this process. It's a continual process. Some of the stepping stones may be in place, but we have to continue to revisit and continue to discuss things. So mainly I tell you all this because I want you to know that we're not all in the same place. I could ask all of you on this webinar today where you're at in the process, and some of you may be just confronting the thought of, I need to do this, and others may be, hey, I'm just making sure that I haven't forgotten something. It's all okay wherever you are in the process. My goal today is to help you move along within that process based on wherever you are today. So if you haven't started, I'm going to give you enough information to get started. If you're towards the end, I'm going to encourage you to keep thinking and keep revisiting what you've already done. So what's holding you back from moving from wherever you're at? Some of you may say, I already have a will. Well, a good chunk of you already said you have a will. And I've told you your work's not done just because you have a will. Some of you may say the kids don't get along. Well, I'll be honest, I have 2 kids. They're both teenagers. And if you've had teenagers, you know they don't get along. So we can't just ignore it just because the kids don't get along. We're going to have to get over that roadblock, and we're going to have to deal with some of that. Some of you may say it's too expensive. Parts of this process are going to cost you money. The goal within what we're doing today is to start you getting your pieces together so that when you do have to start spending money, you're using your time in the office of an attorney in a way that you're spending less money. So if I can tell you things that the attorney's going to tell you to do, and you do it before he tells you, then when you walk in that office, you're not going to be paying for that advice. You've already gotten it for free. You may say, well, the laws keep changing. The laws do change, but there are basics behind succession planning that don't have to do with the laws. They have to do with family dynamics. That may be a surprise you weren't expecting today. We're not going to get into tax law today, but that's the part where the laws change, and that's actually at the back end of the process. You may say that you're too young to worry about this, and I don't know the age of people on here. I have certainly been guilty of saying that I was too young to worry about this, but I will tell you that my mom died at the age of 57. And right now, from where I sit today, 57 doesn't look very old. And so if you're thinking you're too young to worry about this, I'm going to challenge you to think about the fact that we don't know how long we have. And so it's always a good point to start thinking about it now, put things in place. And if you don't have to use it for a while, you don't have to use it for a while. But should something happen, you want a plan in place so that those that are coming, the next generation is able to pick up the pieces and move forward. And then, of course, some of you may say, I have no clue how to start. And that's where we're going next, how to start. So within intergenerational transfer or moving things from one generation to the next, there's all kinds of issues involved. There's money issues within families. We have family members who have medical special needs, educational needs that we need to think about how we're providing for. There may be a lack of skills. And by that, I mean that in a lot of families, what we see is the current generation knows how to do the work, but they haven't actually had the next generation do any of the work. So they're not sure how to do something. If you ask them to go run the tractor, do they know how to take care of the tractor? And so it's those kind of skills that we see lacking when we try to transfer from one generation to the next. We can deal with all of these problems. We see questions of estate taxes, and certainly I said we weren't going to talk about taxes, but we do have to think about that, not really at the federal level anymore, but we do need to think about that at the state level. We have to think about development of relationships. If your kids don't get along, what are you going to do to help them get along so they can work in a relationship to manage the land going forward? Or can you get them to a point where we make the decision that the best thing is to have the land in 2 blocks instead of 1 big block? And then, of course, the big one, the one that nobody really wants to acknowledge, is control. In order to go through the intergenerational transfer process, you have to let go of some control. And I say that because if I've always done everything and I want to hand it off to the next generation, and I know they don't have the skills, and I don't let go of control, they're not going to get the skills, and they're not going to have any chance to exercise decision-making until after I'm gone. At that point, I won't be around to answer questions. And so if we can let go of a little bit of control now, that allows the next generation to kind of flex their decision-making while there's still somebody there to kind of provide some information along the way. So it's really hard to let go of control, but some of this process requires some of that. How do you eat an elephant? You eat an elephant 1 bite at a time. And today we're going to tackle succession planning 1 step at a time. So this might feel like that great big elephant, and in a lot of ways, succession planning is a great big elephant. So step 1 is we're going to collect the information. So we need to know what assets you have. And I'm going to refer to your belongings as assets. That's going to include your land, the timber you have out there, the barns, your house, your bank accounts, stocks, bonds. If your name is on it in any way, shape, or form, that's part of your collective estate at the time that you are no longer with us. And so this stage is really about collecting the information because I need to know what I'm working with. And it's interesting because a lot of times people know that they own things, but they haven't really ever thought about what they're worth. And so in this part of the process, we're looking for the governing documents on things. We're looking for some idea about what things are worth. So we're going to find those documents. Maybe it's the will that you told me you had that you haven't looked at in years. It could be the power of attorney documents. It might be your cost share agreement, your forest management plan. I'm not suggesting you put all the documents in one place, but I would suggest that maybe you make a list of where the documents are. Oftentimes, we don't know when we're going to take our last breath. And the most helpful thing you can do for the person who's trying to handle your estate afterwards, or the person who's going to try to manage the land afterwards, is to give them a guide to where the documents are to allow them to move forward. So if there's a cost sharing agreement on the property that's telling me what I need to do, then I need to know where that document is when you're not around to tell me. The forest management plan is the guide to when we're going to do certain operations on the property from year to year and what to expect. And it's going to tell me about hopefully special places on the property. And so if I don't know where that document is, I'm going to spend a lot of time looking for it. So having that list of those documents is going to be kind of critical. My mom did a lot of things not right when she left us, but one thing my mom left was a list of where everything was. And I will tell you, at that point in time when everybody's grieving, having that list to allow you to do what you need to do is very, very helpful. So then you need to value your assets. And I'm by no means suggesting you pay for an appraisal at this time. Just kind of have some rough idea. And the reason you want to have some rough idea is at some point you're going to make decisions about who's going to get what. If you have more than one child or you're providing for grandchildren, you kind of need to know what's available so that as you're trying to provide appropriately for people, you know what's there. So this is just real briefly how we would kind of figure that out on the timber, because the timber is the piece that you put the trees in the ground, and you may not really know what they're worth unless you've looked at harvesting recently. So if I have timber that could actually be harvested, we're going to just basically do quantity times price. Of course, that means knowing the species and then knowing some idea about the quality. Now, you have to be careful because if we're in a really big boom market where prices are really high, that might give you a little bit of a false sense of value, or if the market is really saturated and prices are really low, you could have the opposite where you're very seriously undervaluing it. So you kind of want to look at an average price. You can talk to a local forester and see if they can help you with some pricing information. Again, I'm not suggesting you pay for an inventory or an appraisal at this point. What's going to happen when you pass away and the estate gets valued is everything is looked at fair market value on the date of death. And so that's what it would change hands between a willing buyer and a willing seller with complete information. And that is going to kind of help you look at what the value of everything is at the time of death. So I would recommend you do some form of recording of these assets. You know, maybe it's just where's the land at, you know, what county is it in? You'd be surprised when people die and their relatives don't even know that they have some of the things that they have. You know, your children may not actually realize that you owned property a state away because you didn't actually visit it. You were an absentee landowner. So recording this information can be super helpful. Bank accounts, it's amazing the number of bank accounts that are essentially abandoned property because nobody knows that they're there. So if you can record that information, that will help those coming behind you. So are you still with me? I'm hoping you're okay. I can't see you all, but I hope I haven't lulled you to sleep with this really exciting information about collecting all your critical information. It's a really important job though, and I encourage you to take it seriously. It's not something you're going to pull off in a weekend though. The next thing I'm going to ask you to do is start thinking about your vision and your goals. And so the little caption I have for you is from Alice in Wonderland. And it says, one day Alice came to a fork in the road and saw a Cheshire cat in a tree. Which road do I take? She asked. Where do you want to go? Was his response. I don't know, Alice answered. Then said the cat, it doesn't matter. You have to know what you're trying to accomplish. If you don't know what you're trying to accomplish, then you can do anything and you're going to get something done and you're going to get somewhere. You need to do this on a financial and a non-financial standpoint. So this isn't just thinking about what do I want to do, passing things on to my kids. Maybe it's thinking about the financial aspects of it as well. So we're going to talk about what the property means to you because that's part of thinking through this vision and goals. And we also want to think about short term. What do I need to accomplish in the next maybe 2 to 3 years? What's going to happen in the long term for this property? So maybe now we're talking 20, 30, 40 years from now. And then what happens within the transition? So I might have some goals on the whole process of transitioning it from my ownership to my children. Maybe that's that I'd like to see those relationships improve between my kids so that they can have a working relationship in the future. So long term, they can manage it together as a family unit. So when you think about goals, you think about in a perfect world, what do I want to see happen in maybe 10 years, 20 years? You can decide that time frame for yourself. But the piece that goes with that is asking yourself, what are the major challenges that are going to stand in the way? If my goal is for the land to stay in the family as one unit and I have 2 kids, maybe the major challenge is getting them to work together. That could be the major challenge there. Or maybe my kids live in different states and they don't actually live where the property is. And so the challenge would be how to continue the management when there is no longer a family member at the property. So I challenge you to kind of think through what your goals are and what challenges may stand in your way. So without a plan, getting satisfactory results is really just a matter of luck. You do something, and if you get a really nice result, you just got lucky. Planning is going to give you the goals and the outcomes and some objectives to accomplish along the way. These are going to lead you somewhere. So why should you identify your goals? It gives you some long-term vision, but more importantly, I'm going to argue it's going to give you short-term motivation. We are creatures of habit. We like to have that checklist and be able to say, I'm getting something done. So having those goals and then having the tasks to help me work towards those goals is going to be really helpful. It's going to focus your acquisition of knowledge. What do I need to know to get to those goals? It's going to help me organize my time and my resources, because let's be honest, time and money are limiting resources for most of us. So by setting some sharp, clearly defined goals, you're going to be able to measure your progress towards those goals and take pride when you actually achieve them. We all like to see that we're making progress and that we actually accomplished what we set out to do. So you see kind of the breakdown between goals and objectives. Goals are a bit abstract. That's your intention and some general directions. And your objectives are going to be a lot more concrete. They're going to be measurable, specific, action-based. But goals are just one step. We're going to have goals. They're going to lead us to some objectives and then to the tasks. So for an example, if my goal is to have continuity of management, the objective is really to protect the business and the land from the consequences related to my death so that we can get to continuity of management. And the tasks that I'm going to undertake to get to this is some lifetime transfers, getting my heirs involved now in the management, and that's going to help protect and continue the management. So just some examples of long-term goals to kind of help you in your thinking. It might be to provide income for your retirement, income for the education of some of the younger family members. Maybe it's a legacy of stewardship you want to protect, to continue to have a place for the family to meet. And for a lot of people, it's to keep the land in the family. And of course, you may have other goals that I haven't mentioned. So we're not going to do this per se in chat, but I want you to think about the barriers that you can identify to achieving your goals. For a lot of people, it's those family issues. Other people, it's lack of time, lack of money, and sometimes it's just fear. Sometimes it's fear of getting started or having some of the difficult conversations. So how are you doing? Hopefully you're happy, but you may not be loving all this. It may sound like a lot of work, but I promise it's going to be worth in the end. If you've gone through some of these initial stages and you walk into the office of a professional and can say, yep, I know where this document is. Here's a copy of my will. Can we check it out? What do I need to do to get from my will to transferring some of the property throughout my lifetime? So while it may not be fun right now, hopefully you're going to be happy in the end with the result. So we're going to take a breather for a second, and I want you to think about what the property means to you. This is something we call the heirloom scale. On a scale of 1 to 10, I want you to think about what the property means to you. 1 being that it's a financial asset only. I only hold this because it's got timber on it. I'm going to sell the timber and it's going to fund my retirement, but that's all it is to me. If somebody offered me money, I would walk away. All the way up to 10, which is our priceless family heirloom. It came through the family or I bought it and I don't want it to go anywhere. I want it protected at all costs. So Mike is going to pop up a poll for us. And this poll is just going to ask you to fill in on a scale of 1 to 10 what the property means to you.
All right, it should be up there. On a scale of 1 to 10, what does a property mean to you? 1 being the financial asset, 10 being the priceless family heirloom.
And Mike, while they're working through that, if we could see if we have any questions.
We do have some questions, Tammy, so while they're working. The first one I thought is a real interesting one. So at the beginning poll, it said that 5% were others. So you see, some were woodland owners, some were natural resource professionals. So the question is, what is the other 5%? And obviously we don't know, but you've taught classes like this a lot. And my guess is that it's probably tax professionals or attorneys. What do you think?
So I'm trying to remember what the categories were. It was woodland owner, natural resource professionals.
Private, public, and nonprofit. So it's really woodland owner, natural resource professionals, or others.
Yeah, I think you're probably spot on there, Mike. It probably is tax professionals. It could be attorneys. Those other professionals that don't consider themselves natural resource professionals. And if I've described who you are and you marked other, then we really appreciate you being here because you are kind of the link for the landowners to handle some of this information, this transition.
All right. The next question you've kind of already answered, but you may want to say more. Estimating the value of stocks is easy, but how do you estimate the value of the trees?
Sure, that's a great question. And so you're not going to necessarily love this answer because I'm going to give a stock answer that says it depends. And so it depends on the age of the trees. So I'll handle it in a couple different ways. If we have mature timber, stuff that I can take to a mill that I'm going to get paid for, to just make it super basic, it's the price that you would get from the mill times the quantity that you have of the product, right? So you would have to have some rough idea of the volume of timber out there, preferably by some product. So if you have a stand of mixed species, you would need to have that broken out. But you can always run it on averages. You could run an average price by product times the rough volume you have out there, and then take out the expenses you would have to pay to harvest that timber. If it's a younger stand, so something that is not going to get paid for, if I was going to buy it, I would see value in that timber anyway, even though I can't haul it to the mill today. That process is a little bit more complicated. We tend to ask foresters to help landowners with that. But basically what you're looking at is a straight line approach of, if I grew those trees to a point where I could harvest them for money, figured out what they'd be worth at that age, let's say it's age 30, and then I would use an interest rate to kind of discount it back to its current age. It's not a really hard process. It's not near as hard as it sounds when I'm just saying it. If I could write it out, it would make a lot clearer sense. But if you need further clarification on that, be sure to send me an email. I'd be happy to point you to some resources that are a little bit clearer on that immature timber valuation.
All right. One more question for now. What recommendations do you have if you're young, haven't had children yet, and have family members, siblings that may not be interested in taking over woodland management? Would you still start the process, or would you wait until you see if you have children or not?
So that's a great question. And so there are a couple ways you can handle it. I did allude to earlier that you're never quite done. And this is why you're never quite done with the process, right? So I think it's really important, we've talked about goal setting. It is important to kind of think through what your goals are. And of course, those goals could change over time, right? If you have children, your goals would certainly change because they would involve other people now. But you could go through the process, and then I'm going to come back to this process in 5 years, see where I'm at, see what's changed in my life. Maybe a major life event has happened to a family member that you now feel the need to provide for, or you thought you would leave it to a sibling, and the sibling is no longer capable of doing that because they've moved, or maybe a sibling that lived across the country has moved home and now is able to be part of that for you. So I don't think there's a wrong time to start this. I think you start it, you get to a place where if something were to happen tomorrow, you would be set. And if it didn't happen, you would just need to revisit. And so we say the same thing with forest management plans. And there are a lot of people right now who are revisiting management plans based on the natural events that we've had happen. That's going to have changed their plan. And so anytime something major happens, you've got to go back and revisit.
All right. So let's see the results of the poll. Share results. So this is what we got.
Great. So you see, can they see the results, Mike?
Yes, everyone should be able to see the results.
Perfect. So you see in this result kind of a distribution that we're all kind of in different places, right? Nobody was a 1, and by no means is there anything wrong. And I should say that right up front. You are wherever you are on this scale. I've done this in a room full of people, and we have some people who their only goal, they bought it with the intention of selling the timber and making money off of it. That is all it is to them. It is an investment, and there is nothing wrong with that. Then we have people who there is nothing that you could offer them that would have them sell that timber or sell that land, that is something that's very priceless to them. And so it's really important to recognize that this is a snapshot in time as well as a snapshot of who you are right now. So if I came back, the question that was asked about what if I have no kids now, if what that person answered this right now may answer it very differently in 5 years if there are children in the picture. So each of us are answering it from where we sit today as far as what it means to us. If you were sitting there at a computer with your spouse, and you could only answer this for one person when you answered this poll, but if I asked each of the family members sitting there at the computer, where are you at on that scale, we could see a very different answer among the same family unit. We could see it between spouses, and we could see it among siblings, how they view that land and what that property means to them.
Yeah, I have a good friend that has property, and she has 2 parcels. One's a parcel that she bought with her husband, and they feel more like a number 1 about that one. Then they have the parcel that they're inheriting from dad and grandpa, and that's an absolute 10. So it really is interesting. Most people can think about this scale pretty easily. All right,
Yeah,
well, I'm going to, go ahead.
I've had spouses within the room, and I say fun, only I can think this is fun. I have one spouse who's a 1 and one's at the 10, and I can usually figure out where the land came from. That the spouse at a 10, the land came down through that family. And then the person who's at the 1, they married into that. And so they may not have that same feeling about it. And sometimes it's actually a resentment because it's taking family time that they aren't necessarily loving. So yeah, you can go ahead and take that down.
All right.
Great.
Ready to roll.
All right. So I said some of this already. Some of this is where you're at today. It's really important that you remember that this is going to change over time, and there is absolutely no right or wrong, and that it can differ a lot between owners. So you've done this today. I would tell you sometime when you're feeling like you want to have some information, go have that same conversation, ask that same question with some family members, and kind of see where they're at on this scale. It's important to know where you are, and then to go ask family members where they are. It's important if you ask that question, though, that you make sure that they know that they're free to be honest about it. I know with my own children that I see behaviors that are done because they want mom to be happy. I'll come home with an article of clothing for my teenage daughter. She'll say she likes it, and it will never come out of the closet. And so when you ask this heirloom scale question to your children or any other family members, make sure that they know that you really want their honest answer, and that you're okay with whatever they say, that you're really trying to find out information so that you can make the best decisions going forward. So now that you kind of know where you're at, and you've thought through some goals, and you've started to ask maybe your family members where they are at on that heirloom scale, it's time to start thinking about who you want to be the future managers, owners, and professionals that are going to help you through the process and continue on, either while you're still alive but transitioning or afterwards, so that the future generations are set up. But again, you have to ask and make sure they're interested. And see, that's part of the trick here, is that we know that there are differences among generations, and that we have to have these conversations to try to understand the motivations of our family members. Are they more interested in technology and less interested in being outside? We do see some of that, although our current situation where everybody's being forced to work in their office at home right now might be changing some people's thought processes. So we need to start asking people, are they interested? Have you had the conversation? The early slide I showed, many people think they're going to leave it to their children, but have they asked their children if they want it? How do you know? You have to start talking to people. So step 3 is engaging the family. And this is probably the scary part for some people, because you're afraid that you're going to hear something that you don't want to hear. So we're going to do 2 things. We're going to do a walk and talk. One of the things I've heard mentioned about teenagers or having these interesting conversations is that sometimes it's easier not to have eye contact. To go on a walk where you're side by side and they feel like they can be more honest because they don't have to look you in the eye to say the honest thoughts. So if you go take a walk and you walk down the road in the woods and just have this conversation about what does this mean to you, make sure they understand that what it means to you, and then find out what it means to them. And then of course, if you do that individually, then it's time to bring everybody together and start having the big conversations. So why would you want to do this? Why would you want to bring everybody together and have a family meeting? Well, first off, it's a way more efficient way to share information than to pick up the phone and have private conversations with each person, because chances are if one person asks a question, somebody else is going to ask the same question. So having a meeting gets everybody together and it's more efficient. It's going to allow you as the owner to share your personal vision, goals, and maybe even the history of the property. Sometimes we assume everybody knows where the property came from and important events that have happened on the property, but we've never actually shared that information. So it gives us a chance to include potential future owners in the planning process. So maybe it's time to revisit the management plan. If we sit down and have a meeting and start having the conversation about what is going to happen in the next 5 years on the property, now these potential future owners can see how they fit into this big picture. Opens a communication pathway. Communication is one of the most important things that's going to go through this entire succession planning process, making sure people feel like they can communicate openly. And this gives people a place to share their ideas and their concerns. You'd be surprised what you hear in the concerns. Maybe the concern is that there's not going to be enough money, or there's not going to be enough time, that this managing the land takes a lot of time. A lot of people don't understand what it actually takes to manage a forest. They may have this idea that it's like growing corn and that it's going to take a lot of day-to-day work and not really understand what the real work is behind it. So this is going to give us a chance to do face-to-face communication, and then back to this working relationship concept. So you've been together as a family unit, you've spent time making meals, celebrating birthdays, anniversaries, but you haven't worked together. And by working together, I mean more than just going and digging a hole in the backyard. I mean thinking through all the things that it takes to make this business operate. Paying the property taxes on time, meeting with NRCS and Natural Resource Conservation Service about potential cost share, meeting with the forester, all these things. that we need to get to a point where we can work together so that we know who brings what to the table to make all these pieces work. We can get some educational things done within our meeting. We can bring in somebody to talk about the importance of thinning, or what does it mean to do some site preparation for planting. So we can bring somebody in to talk to the group so that everybody's a little bit better informed. And then if we need to make decisions, they've got the education needed to make those decisions. And then it allows the children an opportunity to participate in management by handing over some roles and responsibilities as you're comfortable. You don't give them the key to the kingdom right away. You give them pieces and allow them to make decisions, build confidence, and have somebody as a backup to ask questions. So it's important to know that the research is indicating that people are communicating based on their generational backgrounds. And what we know about these generations is that each one has distinct attitudes, behaviors, expectations, habits, and motivational buttons. And so as we go into thinking about having a family meeting, we're going to step away for a second and kind of think about generational differences. Now, of course, these generational things are based on stereotypes. If I say that you're a millennial, we all know that there's some stereotypes that have been built around that generation. That's not always a nice, neat little category. People that are born close to any of the ends of these generations may not look at all like the stereotype. And of course, as is always true, stereotypes are just that. It's a way for us to talk about a whole group of people, but it doesn't represent anybody actually. So there's a ton of difference within the generation, but the reason we want to talk about this is because the land is transitioning from what was the traditionalist to the boomers, and now moving into the Gen Xers. And so there's a lot of differences that we need to be aware of between the generations, and then we want to use the strengths of each generation to make this process move forward in an efficient way. So just a couple of things. I'm sorry, this maybe isn't as clear as I would like. The last column, if we look at what they say about Gen X or the millennials, they believe in collaboration. So if I bring everybody to the table and we start to have the conversation, we're just going to follow that row here for a minute. The traditionalists, these are the ones that are born before 1945. The traditionalists, by stereotype, believe in a chain of command. So this is the person in charge, and decisions are run through the person in charge. And then if you look at the boomers, the next generation, they believe a change in command. And then Gen X wants self-command, make their own decisions. And then the millennials want everybody at the table. So what's really important is these two endpoints. Because if I call a family meeting, I'm going to have maybe my dad at the table as a chain of command, and my child, the millennial, at the table who wants everybody to have a say in the decision making. So if we go into these family meetings and we don't recognize the different expectations that the family members are coming to the table with, we're going to have a bit of a mess. And so what we have to do is think through, how do we recognize the differences and then have the meeting go in a way that's going to make everybody comfortable with what's going on. So I'm by no means saying that this is the end all be all to how everybody operates, but I think it's somewhat enlightening to understand kind of how we're wired and what's affecting us, and that's the baggage, if you will, that we bring to the table. Down at the bottom, you see a little bit about how to communicate, right? The millennials want to know the reason for the change, and that you're there to help, that you're not just going to unleash them without the information, because it becomes a confidence issue. And then if you look at the traditionalists, they want to be appreciated for their efforts and acknowledgement of value. And so that's part of what's going to happen within these family dynamics, is we have to communicate, we have to give appreciation where it's needed, and then support in other places where it's needed. Oops, I apparently have color-coded some things. There we go. So as we manage these generational differences, we need to know that each generation is going to approach work differently. We want each group to provide the strengths that maybe the other group doesn't possess. And so that nice mixture of the generations should give us the skill sets that we're looking for. And then of course, what we have at the table that's really going to be helpful is that those generations with their different strengths can serve as mentors to each other. And so there are skill sets that the older generation is going to be able to provide to the younger generation, but the younger generation has some skills that they've acquired along the way that they can also help mentor the older generation with. We do want to break the bonds of tradition. What tends to happen, if I were to go home and sit at the family table, it's very clear where dad sits. That when I sit down at that table, and this happened at Christmas a couple years ago, my son sat at the head of the table. He didn't realize that's where my dad always sits. And so my son was trying to break that bond of tradition, but we weren't ready for that, right? So in the family meeting, we want to think about, if we always go with what the older person in the room says, then we have no opportunity to look for maybe a better way. That fresh set of eyes may see something that we've never seen before, or they've been exposed to something in another part of their life that they can bring to the table. But we have to be willing to break the bonds of tradition where we always go to the senior member and whatever they say is the way we're going to do it. We're not going to do this in a disrespectful way, but we're going to recognize that we need to hear all the viewpoints at the table. And then, of course, you want to show everybody what the future holds. Where are we going? We're trying to put together a succession plan so that we can have the next generation involved, and we want to go ahead and start that process now. We're going to look for a way for the senior members to gracefully exit if that's what they choose in a way that they're comfortable with, while still providing maybe some support information. And then allow a path for the younger members to start seeing how they fit into this family business and what they can offer. So if we look at workplace characteristics, kind of down at the bottom, the messages that motivate, the older generation, the veterans pre-1945, again, it's that respect and appreciation. The boomers want to be valued and needed. Gen X, they want to forget the rules, so they want to be given the freedom to kind of come up with the rules rather than being handed rules. And then, of course, that next generation, they want to hear that they can work with other people that are creative and bright. And so, again, just kind of some things to think about as we go into multi-generational planning. So I find this is really interesting when we think about generations. If I ask you, how did Kennedy die? When asked to recall how and where Kennedy died, the veterans and the baby boomers are going to say gunshots in Dallas, Texas. Generation X remembers a plane crash near Martha's Vineyard. And then Generation Y might say Kennedy, who? And so these are kind of things to keep in mind as we're having these conversations. Understand their culture and their views and use that to help make decisions and to plan. So as we're preparing for this meeting, we want to appoint a moderator. And I'm not suggesting necessarily this is an outside moderator, although certainly it can be. And that is something to consider, whether early on you feel that the family can handle someone from within being the moderator, or if the family's having some personality difficulties, it might be a good time to bring somebody else in to kind of help on the early stages so we set a different tone. So appoint the moderator. I would encourage you to think beyond the typical family member who always seems to be the figure in charge. So in my house, it'd be very natural to put my dad in charge as the moderator. I would suggest maybe we look to somebody different. Maybe it's one of the children, adult children, asking them to serve as a moderator. Now you can rotate that around, but it's really important that everybody understands the ground rules that this person is in charge of running the meeting. You want to pick the place, the date and time, the location, and think about whether you're going to cover expenses if family members have to come in from out of town. Those expenses might also include whether we need to provide childcare for somebody with younger children who need to be supervised during the time of the meeting. It's really suggested that you have a written agenda and then you send it weeks ahead of time so people can plan and understand what's going to come up within the meeting. If you think back a little bit further than that, maybe not on the first meeting, but on successive meetings, giving them an opportunity to provide topics for the agenda. And then being able to follow up and say, I don't have time to cover all of the suggested topics, but we will get that on a future agenda. Decide on what your specific goal is for that meeting. What are you going to accomplish? And then the topics that you need to discuss in order to achieve that goal within that meeting. And then if there's any handouts that need to be given out prior to the meeting, and then make sure they're part of minutes. And of course, keep minutes. The minutes are super important as kind of a documentation or record of what happened within the meeting. When should you do this? Well, there's no time like the present unless you have to do it over Zoom. So maybe this is not a good Zoom conversation unless you have no other options. So you want to do it as soon as you can in a way that's safe and comfortable for everybody. I recommend staying away from the holidays. Holidays already bring a lot of stress to families. As the mother of a family, when my family comes to visit my house, I'm worried about making sure that everybody's taken care of, that the meals are going off as planned. And there's just a lot of additional stress at holidays. So I recommend thinking about a time of year when we're a little bit more relaxed. Maybe you just plan a weekend, everybody goes somewhere else if you can, or ask everybody to take care of their own arrangements. So that it doesn't put undue stress on anybody. And then of course I would ask when it's best for family members. For family members that have children, you've got to think about them missing school. And so summertime may be best for a lot of family members, but there may be other family members that have a busy time of year in the summer depending on what they do for a living. So you want to kind of gather that information. A really sticky topic is who's allowed to be at the meeting, who you want to invite. When I say children, that could be your adult children, but you do need to address the younger children. What age is old enough to sit at the table and for what parts of the conversation? So I have a 19-year-old and a 14-year-old. There's certain things that we can discuss with the 19-year-old, and I know that that would not go outside if we were talking about finances, but maybe that's not a conversation the 14-year-old needs to be a part of. And you have to decide what that age break is, but you need to be consistent in how you apply the age break. So if I have two adult children and they have children of their own, I can't say this 13-year-old is mature enough and that 13-year-old is not. We want to be really even about how we set those boundaries. We need to decide spouses of children, are they going to be included for all of the meeting or parts of the meeting? And there's certainly the ability to do that, to break it up into parts. We may start the meeting with everybody, including children above, I don't know, the age of 5, 10, whatever you feel like. And at that point, we're just going to talk about the land and the history. And then we're going to break into more of an executive session. We're going to send the children out. Maybe we decide that we're only going to have our children and none of the boyfriends or girlfriends of the children are going to be allowed in the room, or fiancés. We're just going to make our decision on who we're going to limit, and we're going to apply that universally. Grandchildren, and again, just be fair about whatever that decision is and be clear about it up front. The last thing you want is to allow one kid's significant other and not allow the others. So some goals you might have: talk about the history, have some face-to-face communication, working on that working relationship, learning personal needs, desires, and goals of individual family members. Maybe you have some decisions to make right away. And then recognize that first meeting versus subsequent meetings are going to have different goals and objectives. And then we want to begin to involve your advisors to assist the family. So at any point we can start deciding that, hey, we need to hear from somebody with a legal background who can talk to us about different types of family structures. All right, one of the things that should come up when we're having conversations is really talking about this percent of your annual household income that's coming from the forest. I would say that's probably one of the items that people are really hesitant to talk about, but really need to be discussed. And so this is not Oregon. I needed to pull Oregon up. This is a California data. If you look at the percentage of acres, 57% of the acres produces zero annual household income coming off of the forest. You have to make sure that your heirs are aware of this, that there will be money that has to go into the land from somewhere else. You have to have these conversations if you're in that, because I think sometimes we know that, but other family members may assume that it's paying for itself or that it's actually making money. And so if they think it's making money and it's actually just breaking even, that conversation has to happen at some point as you're deciding what you're going to do in the future. So what is success of a meeting? Everybody learned something, had fun, and no feelings were hurt. Maybe that's your definition of success. Hopefully family communication was improved. Maybe for you, it's just the discussion stayed on point on time. That can be a real stickler for some people, that we've got to finish on time and we don't want any side conversations. Maybe your goal of a successful meeting is that everybody participated, that nobody felt like they weren't heard or didn't have an opportunity to speak. Maybe somebody brought up a new topic, says, you know, I really need to better understand this particular topic. If we're going to harvest, I want to understand how to harvest in a way that protects our water, because our water is really important to me. Can we bring somebody in to talk about that? Maybe you made a decision that was really important, and evaluate the meeting as to the success in achieving the goal for that meeting and moving you further along in this process. What could possibly go wrong? Well, if you delay having this meeting, and I'm not suggesting you have to run and go do it this weekend, but you delay having the meeting, you dread doing it, so you keep putting it off. Maybe a critical family member passes away in the meantime, and a transfer happens, and it's going to happen the way, if you don't have a will, it's going to happen the way the state says it's going to happen. So for those of you that when I asked if you had a will and you didn't, the state has a plan for your assets if you don't have a plan. So if you don't have a will, the state will determine how your assets are distributed. And that may not be what you would have wanted. So if we don't get things accomplished and we don't have a meeting and we don't get the plan worked out, you could have a transfer anyway. If you don't have a meeting, or you have a meeting and things go wrong within the meeting, you could lose the input from a member of the family. They get frustrated, they don't feel heard, and they walk away from the process. That would be unfortunate. You could have a meeting and we're not reading the group well enough to understand that people didn't understand the topic. So I launch into a full conversation about estate taxes, and we're going to go do an LLC, and nobody even knew what an LLC was, and so they didn't understand what was going to happen. And then one of the things we talk about with all meetings is that there's no follow through. That we had a meeting, we all talked about what needed to happen, and of course we didn't assign anybody the tasks, and we didn't establish a date for when the task would happen. So maybe we said we need to do this, but nobody was in charge of talking to the forester about a management plan update. And so we have our next meeting and nobody followed through, and we didn't talk to the forester. So some take-home tips on the meeting side of things: have some fun. They don't all have to be dry meetings held at the kitchen table or at a restaurant. You can have fun doing this. Do it out on the property at maybe a shelter you have. Involve everyone, as many people as are appropriate in your process, and then try to get rid of that conflict culture that we have. And I know right now that's kind of difficult, and especially if everybody's been cooped up in the house. How do we really have just this kind environment where we're going to assume the best out of people in this meeting? And then focus on your opportunities and your challenges, not personalities. Really, we're looking at this, what's best for the family moving forward to get this land from one generation to the next. Step 4 is really to create that succession plan. You've done all this fact finding, you've had conversations with everybody. Now you need to make the decisions. Who are your new owners going to be? And then what is the transition to those new owners? And that transition may be a death transition, that it will not be triggered until you've passed away. But that transition can happen now. It can start right now. There's gifting programs available. You can do so many ways of transitioning from generation to generation during your lifetime. But you have to make the decision, what do I want to happen with the land? Do I want to sell it, take the cash, and we can just distribute the cash? Maybe that's the answer if nobody's interested. If you don't have a family member interested, selling it to another landowner, selling it to a beginning landowner is not a bad thing. The only way certain other people are going to get land is if somebody sells it at some point. You could always donate the land. I encourage you, if that's something you're interested in, to make those connections sooner rather than later. You can divide it. So I could take my 100 acres and I could split it among the 5 people I want to give it to. Everybody gets 20 acres. That may or may not be a good answer. Depending on the number of acres, you could actually divide it to a point where it's hard for them to economically do anything on the property. Or you can leave it all to one heir and then take other assets and give them to the other heirs. So there's plenty of options. Don't be limited just to thinking about your children. You know, you could leave it to your spouse. That would be kind of pushing the problem down the road. Grandchildren, you have siblings, maybe you have a younger sibling that could not afford to purchase land on their own. You could look at nieces and nephews. Maybe that niece or nephew went to forestry school and has been really excited but doesn't have the funds, and it's going to be a while before they can afford to buy their own land. Maybe that's someone to leave it to. Friends, neighbors, charitable or conservation organizations. You can leave it to universities. Any of these organizations you leave it to, you want to talk to them ahead of time. My apologies. You want to talk to them ahead of time and try to understand what they're going to do with it. Some organizations, colleges in some cases, if you leave it to them and it's not going to produce the income to kind of pay for its maintenance, or if it's located in an area that's not close enough to the university, they may sell it off. It could go to another landowner, but it's not going where you thought it was going. So it's important to kind of have those conversations ahead of time and understand what's going to happen in the long haul. I want you to think, if you're thinking about between your kids, fair versus equal division. Fair and equal are not necessarily the same thing. I know a lot of people think it's only fair if it's equal. And certainly in my house, we have lots of conversations about equal. Everybody wants the same amount, right? But fair doesn't mean that everybody gets the same amount. And so it could mean that one child needs to be provided for in a different way than the other one does. And so you're going to take that into account. So that could be the financial needs. And then you should think about the sweat equity. Maybe you have a child who has been working on the land with you for years without anything coming back other than time spent with you. Maybe it's an opportunity to give that particular child a little bit more of the land as a way of kind of paying them back for the sweat equity they have put into the land along the way. You can now identify the people that you're going to need to help you, the foresters, maybe it's the tax preparers, maybe it's the attorneys to help you start going into the next part, which is creating the estate plan. And this whole succession planning thing is all the stuff that it takes to make the decisions to then go in and create the documents that are going to carry it out. The documents to carry it out are really the estate plan itself, where you meet with the advisors, you make decisions about your current ownership structure. You know, maybe I'm deciding I'm going to move over into an LLC or a limited liability corporation and start giving shares away during my lifetime so that others can start owning parts of the property. So I've gone all this process to make that decision, and now I'm going to need some help to legally do that and then have that appropriate documentation put in place. So kind of a cautionary tale to end this session today. So this gentleman on your screen is a real estate developer, or was a real estate developer worth over $40 million. In fact, the backstory is that this gentleman was the developer of Staten Island. So he made all this money over the course of his lifetime. And the quotes you see on the screen are what people that knew him said about him. He left a fortune to no one. He was a very smart man, but he died like an idiot. Their words, not mine. Because this gentleman died with no will. And so when you die with no will, the state makes a decision about the distribution of your assets. In his case, the distribution of $40 million. So what happens once this gentleman dies in his 90s is they begin to try to track down his relatives. And what they find is he has no living spouse. They can't find that he has any children. And beyond some of this, the problem is that the records are really sketchy because this gentleman came to the United States during World War II and had come from, I want to say he came from Poland. And so the records in that transition time as people were coming over and escaping Europe at that time, the records didn't necessarily come. And so they knew that he had one spouse, that spouse had died. Of course, someone else that he had spent time with, a female he had spent time with later on in his life. He never actually married her, but the caretaker for that woman came forward and said that he had always intended to leave the money to her. Of course, intentions that aren't in writing are not any good. So why did this happen? This gentleman did not want to plan. $40 million, he really didn't want to plan. Later in his life, I think he said by the time he hit 90, he decided, I should probably do something. And then he procrastinated. You shouldn't procrastinate too long at certain points in your life. And then, of course, maybe it's because he knew he didn't have any heirs, and so he really wasn't sure what to do about it. The really unfortunate thing is how far $40 million could go. Certain organizations, a charitable organization, given even some piece of that $40 million. Or maybe it's a university that had helped him out at some point, or a neighbor's child. There's so many people who could have benefited. The reality is that money is sitting in the coffers of New York State, because until an heir is found or steps up, that money sits locked up in the New York Treasury in their coffers, because it belongs to no one right now, because he did not have a plan that was in writing, legally enforceable. So if today has whetted your appetite, maybe you feel like, oh, that's a lot of information, there's a lot of things I need to do. We have a workshop that we do called Ties to the Land. Ties to the Land addresses rural landowners, whether they're farmers or ranchers or forest landowners. And in this workshop, we take the time to sit down, ask these questions, and give you worksheets to help you kind of work through these preliminary steps, thinking through, what do I have? What do I need to do? And as important as that stuff may sound, the real power in Ties to the Land is sitting at a table with other families and understanding that you're not alone in this process. That no matter how messy you think your family situation is, other people have similar stories, or they have keys to how to move past where you sit today. And so that sharing in these workshops really is kind of the magic behind this process. So right now, we're obviously not doing these workshops in person, but we do have content available online. You can order the workbook. It's in a revision right now that'll be available soon. You can also go to the American Tree Farm System to the mylandplan.org, which is down on the bottom of your screen. I broke Ties to the Land down into about 12 months of content that kind of step-by-step walk you through some of the pieces, bringing in some professionals to talk. Those are freely available for you as well until we can get to a point where we can do Ties to the Land in person. So I want you to remember that, we talked about 5 steps, and in the beginning, I said some of you may not know where to start, but this journey, and this is a journey, this journey is going to begin with you taking that first step. And for some of you, you've already taken that first step. And so what I'd like now is for you to go take that next step. Wherever you're stuck, try to find a way to get out of that place where you're stuck and move into the next part. So with that, I have time for some questions. There's Mike.
You do, sorry. I think I need a new battery in my mouse. Anyway, we do have some questions, Tammy. Great presentation. And I'll just go in the order that they're listed here. So the first one actually was the answer we gave before about the other 5%. Wasn't about the 5% in our survey. It was a 5% in the pie graph that you listed early on in the presentation. So what was that 5%?
So that graphic was about where people were in the process. And unfortunately, this is going to be an unsatisfying response. I don't know. We gave them a chance to kind of not really give us an answer. And that's what we got. So I'm sorry, I do not have more data on that.
Okay, good. At least we got what the really question was about, even though we didn't have a good answer to it. So this question came up when you were talking about the generations, and you talked about the traditionalists, and you mentioned self-command. What do you mean by self-command?
My interpretation of self-command, and I want to be clear that those were things that I found. Those were not my actual words. So my interpretation of self-command is that they don't want somebody telling them necessarily what to do.
I know people like that.
Yeah.
Excellent. So one of the things, and this is my question, that's one of the advantages of being moderators, you get to put your own question in. One of the things that I've observed in my family and in other families, that sometimes the relationship is closer between the grandparents and the grandchildren rather than the parents and the children. Sometimes it seems that if the ties to the land would skip a generation and you just give it to your grandkids, it might be easier. You have any experience or thoughts on that?
Yeah, that could definitely be true, especially, depending on, if the child needed to rebel against their parents or whatever, there's all kinds of reasons why kids and their parents start to pull a little bit apart for a time period. I think we come back closer, later on. But yeah, I think it would be great if we could do Ties to Land and have the grandparents and the grandkids. A lot of times, though, by the time we get somebody in that workshop, the grandkids are too young sometimes to be in there. And so, or they're, teenager-ish, and they're probably not wanting to sit through a workshop, which just means we need to find more creative ways to engage that generation below. So And we've in other places talked about how do we engage those grandkids. Well, have them come out, have them go out, walk with you, go do something that they would find fun. And I think that's the key, is exciting that two generations below, exciting them about being out there. And it can't be all work. It has to be fun. And I think part of this is recognizing that if all it is every time we go to grandma and grandpa's is we all have to do work, they're not interested in it. So there has to be some fun time out there. I've seen some great examples where people have, put in a fire pit. They've got a pond for fishing, and so a lot of the activity out there is happening around these places that are fun. And then you can have the discussions around that fun time.
All right. Excellent. So another question about the Ties to the Land program, and people have heard about it. Can you kind of describe again, because I know COVID isn't going to last forever and we're going to be putting it on again. So what exactly do you go through when you do the Ties to the Land program?
Sure. So when we have Ties to the Land in person, we have a day, usually a lot of times it's a Saturday. So we'll have a Saturday where we'll go meet somewhere, and you'll come in the morning and we'll break the family units up. We'll kind of have you split up among different tables, and that allows your family unit to have more experiences than if you all sat there and tried to talk to each other, which you get to do all the time. So we're going to split the family up. You're going to see some presentation, a little bit of presentation, and then a little bit of work. And so that little bit of work may be asking you to think about what would you like to see happen on the land, right? What are your goals? And having you sit there and kind of go through the exercise of what are my goals? And then having a discussion around the table among other families, what are your goals? And you may hear something from another family that really piques your interest. Well, how did you do that on your property? And so what we know is that oftentimes you're going to learn more from your peers within the room than you're going to actually hear from me. I'm there to facilitate the conversation, to give you things to think about, and to allow you guys, you all to kind of share within that space. And that's what we're going to hope you walk away from, is feeling like you can embark on this journey and kind of give you the kickstart you need. Excellent.
All right. I've got a couple more questions. That's all from the audience. So before we use up everybody's time with my questions, I want to have you put on the final slides, and we'll give a pitch about the upcoming workshops and webinars. And at the same time, I will post the closing poll. And the closing poll is just really, it's a wrap up, and we won't cover this. And you all can, as soon as you're done, you can move it off of your screen so it doesn't cover our thing. So in addition to Tree School Online, OSU Extension, oh, sorry about that, hit my microphone. OSU Extension and the Partnership for Forestry Education are also doing another series called Forests of Eastern Oregon. And we have one scheduled for Thursday of this week. Jacob Putney, who's the new guy on the block, the new extension agent in Baker County, is going to talk about dwarf mistletoe. So that's available. These are also free, and you can register online. Next one, and they're in the evening, on Thursday evening. And so then the next one is, our next one in the Tree School Online series is October 20th. And this is David Diaz and Sarah Loreno from EcoTrust are going to talk about a new management planning tool, making maps, that they've been developing. And this is in cooperation with the Oregon Tree Farm System in a grant that EcoTrust has received from the NRCS. And it's a pretty cool tool. So we think a lot of people would be interested in that. So again, sign up at Tree School Online at the address on your screen there. So while you all are doing the poll, we'll take a couple minutes, and it's only 4:29, so we have another minute without going into overtime. And the question that I will ask Tammy is, one of the things about planning is it seems so final. You always, well, you do a will, you can change the will. But once we start this plan and I decide we're going to form a LLC and have my kids all be full partners, I can't turn it around. So is that a challenge? I mean, can you do a provisional thing? You know, if you guys are nice to me, we'll pass it on, but you mess up and I'm taking it back.
You know, it depends, right? So you can set it up in ways that can be kind of a trial situation before you go into something really formalized. And so if there's concerns about them going in a direction that you're not going to be happy with, then maybe we need to take an intermediate step and put something in place where they don't actually get ownership, but you're giving them some ability to make decisions in ways that you're comfortable, because not everybody's going to be comfortable handing over the key right away, but giving them little pieces to kind of start the conversation and see how people are working.
All right. And then my final one is, as obviously we're able to do webinars on Zoom, is there a role for, you know, video conferencing in family meetings? Maybe not your big annual planning meeting, but how about some, you know, quarterly meetings or something, because families live all over.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as we're becoming more comfortable with technology, and I think at this point, most people have had at least one Zoom experience. And so I think, you know, this answer is very different than it would have been a year ago, right? A year ago, I'd said I would have stuck away from it because, you know, some of people in the family might not be comfortable at all. I think it comes down to the content that you're going to discuss. The more sensitive, the more emotional, you probably need to do that in person. So if it's just kind of an update on the operations, or, hey, we did a harvest, this is what's going on, that kind of stuff totally can be shared in Zoom, especially if you have some people who are maybe a little mobility challenged. We can go ahead and provide pictures through Zoom, or even videos to share. So yeah, I think much more tools now to do that.
Very good. Well, I want to thank Tammy for joining us. And I want to thank the audience for joining us. You guys hung in here pretty well. We had about 47 on the call today, which is pretty good. And just a reminder, I didn't hit my microphone, that the webinar today was recorded and Amanda posted where it will be available. You'll also get a follow-up email tomorrow from Julie Woodward that will tell you where to go to see the webinar on the recording. So thank you all. Tammy, it was a pleasure as usual to listen to you.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye, everybody.